Well, I guess that when Jamie asked me to deal with the topic of Manifest Destiny and Hispanic Heritage Month, I don't know, I thought a little bit about how to approach this, and I can tell you for my students who are here, and thanks for coming, that we're supposed to do a little write-up of this. The way I'm going to approach this is basically I have 5 sections here to the talk. I'm going to give an introduction. I'm going to talk about the pre-Columbian and colonial period. Then I'm going to talk about U.S. Western expansion. And then I'm going to discuss the Mexican displacement after that expansion took place. And finally, some conclusions. So those are sort of the 5 sections that I'm going to be dealing with here as you kind of do your brief write-up of all this. And at the end, I'm going to save some time for questions. So I'm going to try to keep this fairly concise so we have time for all that. Well, in terms of introductory remarks, I wanted to talk a little bit about what's going on today. And it's a tough time for Latinos or Hispanics or whatever you want to, label you want to use in the United States, right? We saw in the Trump campaign that it initially started, part of his initial campaign had very strong nativist elements to it. And it put a lot of the blame for problems in the United States on Latinos, probably more specifically Mexicans, associating them with violence and other problems in American society. We also saw, as part of his campaign, this idea of building a wall, which is still there. Obviously, Mexico is dangerous. We need to be kept separate from it. Right? We saw other things, like recently, the president pardoning Joe Arpaio, who was jailed for his not following the law in his violations and treatments of undocumented people in his state. So we're also today, Trump canceled DACA. Today's the last day for people to apply for rights under DACA. The program ends in 6 months. You can't forget the fact that Trump had testimonials at many of his rallies. The testimonials were by whites who had their loved ones, family members, friends had been victimized by, as Trump would put it, illegal aliens. So you could even extend this to the recent conflict with Puerto Rico and the mayor of San Juan, in which Trump complained that this is costing the federal government too much money, and also that, hey, if things aren't working out, it's because the Puerto Ricans aren't up to the task. I mean, I do think that while we don't have a high death toll in Puerto Rico, the fact of the matter that basic services, electricity, water, many hospitals being closed is still going on today after a couple of weeks is an issue and a concern that if it was happening in the continental United States, there would be more outrage about that. So one point I'm going to make is that, according to the Trump campaign, these people are a problem. They don't belong here. And we need to get them out. The second point, introductory remark I want to make is that Trump is nothing new. there has been strong nativism in the United States for decades now, right? People, in the nice introduction, it was mentioned I went to the University of California, Irvine. I was there in the 90s when Pete Wilson was governor. Things weren't going well. An anti-immigrant campaign was what he used to promote a re-election. He also promoted Proposition 187, which denied rights to undocumented people. And we've seen even before Trump came to power, Jan Brewer in the Southwest passing a papers, please law, which basically said you could stop anybody and ask them for papers if they look suspicious. It was ruled unconstitutional. There's other interesting stories. There's stories of, for instance, parents who are here and their children, Latinos, are graduating from college. And maybe they're maybe in Texas, in Austin. And they can't travel there because of the fear of the checkpoints of being captured and deported. I forgot to mention along those lines, under the Trump administration, ICE has been beefed up, and there's a lot of fear. This is a thing that Trump didn't create. It's something he built off of. And it's proved very effective in his political rhetoric. One quick sort of side note, in that you know, and this isn't really the function of the talk, but I wanted to throw it in. If you actually look and analyze the consequences of the Latino population in the United States on a number of issues, you can see, for instance, the issue of the complaint about wages. If you look at it, actually, wages are not very negatively affected by the Latino population. It's in certain sectors that wages will end up being depressed. And furthermore, if we look at the 19th century, low wages to Latinos subsidized American Western development, right? That's one thing. Another thing, if you look at crime, statistics show that undocumented people commit way less crime than citizens. And frankly, there's, you know, while Trump touted all these people who have been killed by undocumented people, we don't know how many undocumented people have been killed because we don't keep statistics on that stuff. They're subhuman in a lot of ways. If you go to the issue of a financial drain, of these people are a financial drain, when Trump promoted the idea of exporting the 11 million undocumented, the Congressional Budget Office said, you can't do that. Who's going to subsidize Social Security for our older people? That's a dirty secret. These people are subsidizing that. And you know, instead of taking benefits out of the system, the citizen population is benefiting off of it. Okay, so based on this idea that this group of people does not belong here today, I wanted to give a talk that gave a different slant or perspective on all this. And so this would be moving from my introduction to my section 1. And the slant is the slant, if we think about American history, we usually think of it coming from west to east, right? Across the Atlantic, Jamestown being the first American colony that's ever created. And we look at American history in that way. There are other ways to look at it. You can look at American history as migrations of nomadic people from Asia to the Americas across the Bering Strait during the Ice Ages. So this other movement. You can also look at American history as a movement not from west to east, but from south to north. A movement from Mexico into the United States. So I want to take this perspective for a minute, this south to north creation of the United States. And it all starts with, well, it depends. I'm going to show you two starting points. One of the starting points is going to be colonialism, and the other starting point is going to be pre-Columbian era. In terms of the colonialism starting point, it starts with the Spanish conquest, 1519 to 1521. And Spain creates this vast empire, the first European nation to colonize the Western Hemisphere. Right? And that colonization starts in central Mexico, Tenochtitlan, as my students know. That's where the large sedentary groups of people lived. And in addition to that, there was a northern movement of the Spaniards during the colonial period. And this northern movement to areas of semi- and non-sedentary peoples was a little bit spurred on by the discovery of Zacatecas in sort of central northern Mexico, silver mines. But what we see in the 1540s and 50s is movements northward, movements that go to New Mexico, Arizona, California, all the way to Kansas. We see continued movement northward at the end of the 1500s and into the 1600s. Right when Jamestown is founded in 1607, the Spaniards found Santa Fe in 1609. The Spaniards also set up society in New Mexico with the Pueblo Indians, and the presence is great enough for the Pueblos to revolt against them in the later 1600s because they don't like being ruled that way. We see in the 1700s, well before American independence, a whole set of missions set up in California by the Spanish. And it's worth noting that the way scholars conceive of this area, it's Mexico's, or also called New Spain's, northern frontier. And the northern frontier has frontier institutions. The church, or in the form of the mission, where you have semi- or non-sedentary Indians who are brought into the mission system, and the presidio, or military fort, that are strategically located. The whole idea of it was this: our power and our wealth is in central Mexico, where the mines are, where the sedentary people are. And we want to have a buffer zone and protect our north because of fear of the British. On the Pacific, the Russians, the French, these different European powers that may want to take power. Spain was particularly interested in the Pacific because of the Manila Galleon. They would send silver out from the Pacific coast of Mexico to the Philippines. And so you get this, what we get here is an Spanish, albeit somewhat fragile, occupation of these frontier regions, which are called California, New Mexico, and Texas, well before Americans arrive. In the 1960s, we see that some Mexican-American scholars, some of them call themselves Chicanos, this idea of people, Mexicans who lived in the area that was annexed by the United States, And so they were there first, these Chicanos. And they actually began going back further with their history to maybe the year 1000. They connected their roots to this region to the Mexica, who were a non-sedentary group who migrated from somewhere in the north. Nobody knows exactly where. The Chicanos tend to think of it as this area that was annexed by the United States to central Mexico. Their ancestral lands that they migrated from the north to central Mexico was Aztlan. Actually, the Aztecs, the group, the Mexica or the Aztecs, tried to figure out, well, what's the deal with this myth? And they couldn't figure out exactly the origin point. But the point is here, it's these Mexica who migrated southward as a non-sedentary group, settled in the Valley of Mexico, learned sedentary ways of life, created the Aztec Empire. They're the group, so their roots are actually in the Spanish North, someplace. So one way that the Chicano scholars have conceived of this area and the peopling of North America in the United States is this south to north movement after the conquest. But they've gone back even further and see this north, right, in the US Southwest someplace. Foundation is Aztlan, going south and then going back north again. And one thing that gives, this is a cultural identity thing, and one thing that gives it some additional credence is that in Mexico, there was a lot of blending between natives and Europeans. So this sort of, there is, while racial concepts are constructed, there's no truth to them all, the construct for Mexico is the mestizo, this blending between European and indigenous. So if you look at some books by some Mexican-American or Chicano scholars, there's a famous book, and it's called Occupied America. And the perspective here is that the regions that the United States annexed, the Mexicans were there first. The United States is an occupying force. This gives a different way of thinking about belonging, right? Gives a different way of thinking about it. And so what happens here to this region in terms of the United States being able to take control over what is half of Mexico's territory? How does that happen? How does that land transfer happen? How does a Spanish northern frontier turn into the United States? Well, so that now I'm on I guess I'm on part 3 now, right? Part 3. Okay. So once Mexico becomes independent from Spain in 1821, it still has those same frontier institutions, the missions and the military forts. However, these institutions are not very robust. And Spain always had a weak hold in the first place. One of the issues is there's a secular movement in Mexico, the idea of separating church and state, which ends up weakening the power and reach of the missions because they have vast land holdings. The Mexican state is broke, and because of that, it's not able to pay their soldiers on the frontier. I forgot to, one thing I should add here is that many of these soldiers, these military colonists, were given vast land grants by Spain. So they were substantial property owners even if the area wasn't very developed. So the frontier control is weak, but it's definitely territory that belongs to independent Mexico. Enter the United States. The United States starts out as this tiny little country stuck to the eastern seaboard, right? It's true with the Treaty of Paris of 1783, we have Western movement. But the United States is, in its geographic size, just like the British colonies in the New World versus the Spanish, is much smaller. However, you do begin to get an expansionist urge in the United States around independence. One of the reasons that some of the natives sided with the British when the United States was trying to become independent is because people like Jefferson and Washington. These people were land speculators. And the natives read the writing on the wall that their agenda was Western expansion. Under Jefferson, we have the Louisiana Purchase, which doubles the size of the country. And it's one thing worth noting about this. Jefferson talked about his empire of liberty. And one important thing about Jefferson was that he sold a vision of America. He became, the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans were extremely popular. What was the vision? It was a vision that was egalitarian because we have a country of farmers. Small farmers who can work independently, who don't have a boss above them, and it's sort of this agrarian republic ideal. Industrialization, we have owners of factories in a broken working class at the bottom. We don't have that. We have a country of farmers. Of course, this requires Western expansion. After Jefferson's presidency, there was continued ideas about Western movement. And we had the purchase of Florida in the 1810s, in part by force. And then we come to the case of Texas. And Texas is really important on our story because Texas was a part of Mexico's north, and it was annexed by the United States. How does this happen? Well, initially, the Mexican government, there's a dictum that's to populate is to govern. We need people, right? The whole idea was we got this vast country, we don't have that many people to develop the resources, let's invite foreigners in. This actually happened in the colonial period before Mexico became independent. It continues after independence, and Mexico began to invite Americans into Texas. And it was seen to be, they gave them benefits, special privileges. Stephen Austin and others come over bringing these colonization societies. They get breaks on, on land taxes, and it's made a sweet deal. And for, as you know the story, in this case, American expansion westward, this is something that Jefferson didn't really figure in much, but he should have because he was a slave owner, was linked to the Western expansion of the institution of slavery. So the U.S. colonists coming into Mexico were expanding the institution of slavery in cotton production. Mexico actually, getting concerned that there were, this colonization scheme had worked too well, said we're going to abolish slavery. And we're not going to let any more slaves in because we're afraid all these Americans who are now outnumbering Chicanos or Mexicans 5-1 don't seem to want to integrate in our country. And by the way, Texas is contiguous with the United States. So there's concern. What's going to happen? And so Mexico abolishes slavery. Stephen Austin and others keep going to the federal government to get exemptions. And then finally, in 1835-36, Texas made a break for independence. It had its own independence war. Part of that war was centered around the issue of the federalism. How much power should the states have from the central government? And a new power had come to a new government had come to power in Mexico that was more centralized, was hand-picking governors. So actually, Chicanos, those Mexicans in Texas, and American colonists together created Texan independence. In 1836, Texas becomes the Lone Star Republic. And from 1836 to 1845, Texas remains independent. And there are some ideas that it should be annexed to the United States, but resistance to that comes from a couple of quarters. One is, there's this concern it might cause war with Mexico because Mexico has always wanted to regain Texas and doesn't accept the legitimacy of Texas being independent. Just like the North didn't accept the legitimacy of the Confederacy with the US Civil War. So they're not exact parallels, but you can see some similarities. An important part of a country breaks off, the central government says, we're not having any of it. Another issue that weakened this desire for annexation was that there was this fear. This is a big conflict between the slave and free states, and the idea was that if Texas gets annexed, it's going to be a slave state, and the balance of states is going to go in favor of the slave states, slave power. They're getting too much influence. So abolitionists in the Northeast were opposed to the annexation. Enter President Polk, 1844 presidential election, a Democrat, more the expansionist party as opposed to the Whigs, who were more lukewarm about it, and some opposed it. The Polk begins to campaign on an expansionist platform. And this is when the concept of manifest destiny, coined by O'Sullivan, is strengthened. And Polk utilizes the manifest destiny language to try and to propel his campaign to the presidency. So what is manifest destiny? It's this idea that becomes prominent in the 1840s, that the United States is destined to to occupy the whole continent, to go all the way to the Pacific. The United States is destined to take control over these areas. But the way that it's described or depicted is what one scholar called expanding the area of freedom. So the question becomes, how is this freedom, right? How is it expanding the area of freedom? Well, one, there was concern about foreign powers. The Monroe Doctrine from 1823 had said that foreigners, Europe out. The Americas are free from foreign control. This is America's sphere of influence. Europe, don't come back and colonize. So there was concern, for instance, in independent Texas, Great Britain played a role. There were also numerous filibusters where basically individuals unauthorized by the government would, with their private armies, would try to take over parts of northern Mexico. When later, in a little bit later period, when France actually invades Mexico during the US Civil War, France says, if we didn't do it, the US was going to do it. So this idea that these foreign powers are trying to carve up the region, and Manifest Destiny said, monarchical Europe, unequal Europe, We don't want them to plant their institutions here. We want a freedom and Republican values. So basically, this manifest destiny was, in this expansion, was justified as a way of liberating people and also crowding out the possibility of European monarchy reestablishing itself, free institutions instead. Polk, 5440 in fight, the idea of taking Oregon from Britain, the idea of annexing Texas and maybe going for a land grab for more of Mexico. This was part of his expansionist manifest destiny campaign, which got him catapulted to the presidency. So what happens essentially is that he annexes Texas. Mexico does not accept it. There's a lot of complicated diplomatic relations. We don't have time to go into those. But after that, the U.S., there's a dispute over, now that the U.S. has annexed Texas, where's its southern border? Is it at the Nueces River or further south at the Rio Grande? And of course, the colonial era maps had it in the smaller size, that it didn't go as far south. Polk sent troops into the disputed area, claiming, as he claimed, Texas was bigger than the colonial maps said it was. American blood was spilled, he says, on American soil, even if the maps didn't back up on that. And it's worth noting that people who opposed the war pointed this out to Polk at the very moment. And we have the Mexican-American War. And it's a war that takes, the conflict starts in 46, most of the fighting is in 47. By 48, it's over. I'm just trying to look at my time here. I'm having trouble seeing the clock. All right, I'm going to speed up a little bit. Okay, so the war is over, and it ends with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And what that treaty does is it gives Texas, which has already been annexed, New Mexico, and California, these other two territories, to the United States, which ends up being about 6 U.S. states today. It's about 50% of Mexico's territory. There was actually a push by Polk, it was called All of Mexico. He wanted to take the whole country, but for complicated diplomatic reasons, he only gets half of it. So what's the status of, so we're going to do now a quick part on the status of the people of Mexican descent who were living in the annexed areas. Okay? So what's going to happen to these people? By the way, part of the way that manifest destiny was justified in the case of Mexico was by saying that, you know what, Mexico's great. Its rulers are great. But the problem is, the people are great. The problem is tyrannical rule. If the Mexican people can be freed from that tyrannical rule and be under the control of the United States, they'll flourish and do well. So in other words, we want to help these people and prevent tyrannical government from exploiting them. The U.S. is going to be an aid to these people. That was part of the argument. It's also worth noting, and which I haven't mentioned, is that there were countless attempts for the United States to buy places like California that Mexico always rejected. So it had to be war. There was no other option. So the people of Mexican descent who were in these areas had options. They could, one, they could leave and go back to Mexico. Two, they could stay but keep their Mexican citizenship. Three, they could stay but become American citizens. Actually, all three options were taken, but many did become American citizens. You didn't have to apply to become American citizen. It was just automatic unless you requested something else. But there were some issues. What was the status of these people? they were sort of, on the one hand, they were citizen, but on the other, they were also seen as conquered peoples. Another issue is many of these areas that we have the Mexicans going, that have been annexed remain territories. At this point in time, if you were a citizen of a state, you had more rights and protections than if you were a citizen of the federal government, a federal citizen of the United States as a whole. So what we see happen to this group of people of these Mexicans in the aftermath is displacement and exploitation. We talked about the fact that there were these large land grants and there were many large Mexican ranchers in the region. Of course, they're exploiting the natives, so that's happening still in this case with the Mexicans too. But what we see over the next couple of decades is by the 1860s or 70s, the Mexicans have lost almost all their land. How does this happen? Well, one way is the California Land Act and land acts in other states in these annexed areas, which with the purported goal to shore up property titles and strengthen private property security, it became a vehicle for Anglos to challenge the validity of Mexicans' deeds. And while Mexicans did win some cases in California, the cases were tried in Sacramento. They were done in English. You had to pay lawyers. Very expensive. In addition to that, we had the problem in the 1860s and 70s of drought. So there were the natural challenges also. But through the challenging of the land deeds and through the expenses of the court cases, we see most of the land transferred. Another way that land was transferred was through marriage. In Mexico, you had partable inheritance. And there were a lot of wealthy females. In the United States, we have the concept of coverture, and the property and political voice of a woman is controlled by her husband. So some Mexican women married Anglo men, and their property then transferred to the control of their husbands. It's interesting. Mexico changed its laws to primogeniture and as a form of inheritance system, but that's later in the 1880s and 90s, which had adverse effects for women. Interestingly, another quick example about how this area didn't benefit Mexicans, once the gold rush starts in 1849, almost immediately Americans put on a foreign miners tax. This is a land they've just annexed, and it's not expensive to, you don't need much capital to stake a claim and begin looking for gold. So in California, they made the foreigners, including the Mexicans, pay this tax as a barrier to entry. So what we can see is that as this concept of occupied America is that this land was occupied originally by indigenous people, then by the colonial state, then by independent Mexico, and the United States annexed it, occupied it, and displaced the Mexican population that was there, even though they were supposedly granted citizenship status. Let me turn to our last part, which is the conclusion. And what we can say here in the conclusion is this. Turning back to today, we can see that there has been lots of concern in the United States about the Latino population. And if we look, we can see the growth of the Latino population if we look into the 20th century, starting with the Spanish-American War, which incorporates Puerto Rico as a territory. We can also see it actually in the early 1900s through lots of Mexican migration to the United States to work as the economy was booming. A lot of them were kicked out in 1930 with the Great Depression, even some American citizens. Then we see the coming of World War II, and the US cooperated with Mexico in World War II in the military efforts in the Pacific, economic development, and even a bracero program, which brought in thousands and thousands of Mexicans to work in the United States because of the production needs, because Americans went off to war. That ended in '62. Mexicans were forced back into Mexico after that. We also see in the 20th century the Cuban Revolution. And with the Cuban Revolution of 1959, it brings in anti-Castro folks who the United States helped come in, flying the planes, et cetera, coordinating, and we have the growth of Cuban-American Miami. We also see in the Cold War, and of course, Cuba was a Cold War enemy, and therefore these people were given support to come to the United States. Also, as part of the Cold War, we had these massive wars in Central America in the 1980s. Guatemala alone, 200,000 people killed. Lots of Central Americans became flooding to the United States because of this conflict. These people were not welcome because the United States was allies with the governments. Nevertheless, they begin to come. Also, we see, owing to population growth and to population growth and globalization, the greater levels of Mexican migration to the United States around the 1990s. It's an era of, because better health conditions, growing populations, a global economic slowdown results in the highest levels of migration to the United States that we've ever seen from Mexico. So from the perspective of many Americans, America came, British America came first. These people who coming from Latin America are sort of are unwelcome and maybe causing problems for us. There are a flood of newcomers. They're immigrants. Right? They're newcomers. They're immigrants, and they're problematic. From the perspective of Chicano history, it might be thought of as paradise recreated, in the sense that we have had this is a region that we predominated in. It was occupied by the Anglos with the War of '47, and it's really our homeland, Aztlan, and we're Americans who have been here well before the first British settlements on the continent. Thank you. So I don't know if anybody has any questions.
I've got a microphone. If there are questions, just raise your hand and I'll bring you I'll try to turn it on first and bring you the mic. I think that's it.
Would you comment on what you think the role of race was in Western expansion and manifest destiny?
Okay. The role of race in Western expansion and manifest destiny. Well, one example I like to give to students is the example of the Cherokee, because they were an indigenous group that attempted to follow American ways, in Georgia, and they had they actually created kind of a governmental system that had some similarities to the United States. They had a newspaper. And some of the Cherokee, how American could you get? They had plantations with slaves. What we see, it's this, maybe this doesn't quite fit, but this idea is if we can't beat them, join them, like the Cherokee wanted to go the pacifist route. Nevertheless, because they were white and they were not considered, they weren't considered American citizens. So identity of America was connected to whiteness, and they were displaced. It's actually worth noting on this point. Under Mexican law, I'm not saying all the natives were treated great, but they were citizens, which was a whole kind of, the way citizenship was constructed changed after Mexico became independent. However, they were citizens, and they lost that citizenship status when the United States annexed the territory. So this is sort of, if you're going to think about, I mean, the other piece of Western expansion that people don't talk so much about, the expansion of the Cotton Belt and the institution of slavery. So whiteness is a key piece of this Western expansion, and the idea that this territory is for the white population. And even under Andrew Jackson, we see that the land of the expropriated natives was given to whites at below market prices. So they're actually, so race played a big role.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Yes. At the beginning, you pointed out this new Trump's policy about Mexicans, but I didn't know, and I wonder how long Mexicans are considered here as a criminal, because for me, that new adjective was new in his campaign.
Okay, so how long so what are the antecedents to this notion of the, well, the general, there's sort of a narrative and kind of way of understanding that Trump built upon, right? And so one of the ideas is that that the people from Mexico would be a very big burden on the Social Security, social welfare system, demanding these privileges they shouldn't be able to, that are too expensive. They're taking out of the system and not putting in. So that's one way. Another way is just that, you know, the term illegal immigrant, right? So I mean, they're defined. I don't know if you could even define somebody as a person as being illegal. So it seems to me that maybe the issue of where Trump did the thing where he had the testimonials of the whites talking about how their loved ones were victims of unauthorized people, right, who had perpetuated these crimes against them. It's maybe that's taking it to another level. But the idea behind that, before that, I think, was that they're taking our jobs. Maybe they're going into communities and breaking the law. Part of it was a little bit linked to the drug culture in Mexico being expanded across the border. But actually what you see is that people who aren't documented don't have much power, right? So you can work someplace and and if your employer decides not to pay you, they don't pay you. They actually know paydays for undocumented people. They know the day, and that they always go for cash. Those are good days to rob them. So I remember I was on a plane once with this guy, and he was part of the apple growers of New York, and he was promoting it. And he was promoting Mexican labor as a because they had a labor shortage, and his whole argument was that you've got these people, they're working outside. There's nothing, there's nothing negative about this. These are hard workers, but I think there's a kind of he was trying to promote that, the ability for them to continue coming. But I think that it's working against this kind of a narrative that these people are breaking the law, causing problems, being a burden on the social service system in the United States.